Welcome, everyone, to the program on international terrorism today, financing that terrorism, or trying to prevent the financing of that terrorism, I believe is the goal. I am Margaret Hill, and I'm the program's chair for the World Affairs Council Inland Southern California. Our council is delighted to be co-sponsoring this important program on how international terrorism is funded. Many thanks to the Nebraska World Affairs Council and Michael Adams for taking the lead and hosting the Zoom event on their campus. So Zoom has an opportunity for us to participate in things in other parts of the country. And thanks to my friend Christine Checkler, president of the San Diego World Affairs Council, one of our Southern California partner councils, she distributed the flyer to her constituents as well, and this increased our outreach to even greater numbers than we had before. So I think you're going to find that this program is interesting and of great value to you. So Michael, I'd like to turn the mic over to you, and would you welcome your people as well?
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Adams, and I'm director of the Nebraska World Affairs Council. I'm happy to welcome you to today's webinar, which I think you will find fascinating. The Nebraska World Affairs Council's roots go back to 1972. So we're looking with enthusiasm to our 50th anniversary in 18 months' time. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization, and our mission is to provide educational programs and engagement opportunities together with our partners to our three targeted sectors, which are students, young professionals, and community leaders, so that they may become competent, informed global citizens in this very complex and interconnected world that we all live in. Nebraska, interestingly, ranks 37th in population, but first, second, third, or fourth in certain export categories. Export provides 60,000 jobs in Nebraska and represents 6% of the state's economy. So there's a big demand for people with global-oriented background. Our programs cover a wide range of world affairs topics, including things like food security, conflict resolution, climate, U.S. foreign policy, human rights, and many, many more, but you get the idea. I invite all of you to follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn to learn more about our programs and events. Global citizens are needed here. We hope you'll join us. Thank you.
And I'm Patrick McNamara. I am here at the University of Nebraska in Omaha, and I'm the Director of International Studies. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ian Oxnevad, who is our speaker today. He is a lecturer at Cal State San Bernardino and is actually a political economist by training, specializing in the financing of terrorist activities. And that's what we're going to hear about today. I was particularly interested in his background, not only as an academic, and he's done a lot of scholarship, especially on the Middle East, but also as an advisor to government agencies and really working as what I would call a practitioner and an academic, a pracademic in the best sense of that word. So Ian, over to you. Let me say one thing before I hand it over, and that is during the presentation, if you have questions that come up, please type them in the chat. There will be a time at the end where we will have a Q&A, which I'll help facilitate, but throughout the session, you can just type it in the chat function. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you. That was quite the introduction. So I want to start off with the question of why. So once upon a time, when I was working on one of my degrees that happened to be Arabic, there was a gentleman in one of my classes briefly who years later turned out to be a terrorist and murdered 14 people in my hometown. So these are the victims of that attack. And just to kind of give you some motivation as to why I push myself to study this, and while I can't be Iron Man and fly around the world zapping terrorists on my own, I can figure out better ways to try to pick their pockets and make their lives a little more difficult. So kind of put this in a framework. If you're studying this professionally, or you're looking for theories to guide it from an academic sense, terrorist financing or threat finance, money laundering, economic warfare, all these different things do not neatly fit into any subfield of political science or political economy. It really is a hybrid of security studies and political economy or economics. When I started my PhD program, I wanted to study terrorism and state failure. Everyone I wanted to work with left in the first year, and I was left with a bunch of economists. So what I did was basically combine what I was getting in the PhD program from political economy and econ with what I had brought in from national security studies. And what I started to realize is that there is this hidden sort of world that is underexplored, where you have everything from corruption to money laundering, terrorist financing, that we know it's occurring, but our main theories of political science or political economy and international relations just simply do not touch. And the more I dug, the more questions that emerged. So if you're looking to study this, it's an underdeveloped field. If maybe you're in grad school or in academia or in the policy world, just know that social science is catching up and trying to catch up with what is otherwise a rapidly growing and evolving phenomenon. All right, so I want to kind of start off with a big question. Some people are wondering, well, why are we going to talk about what money is? Well, money is kind of mystical if you think about it. It is universal and particular at the same time. So if I asked you, if we were in a room, raise your hand if you think it's in your best interest to be wealthy, my guess would be that all of you would raise your hand, even if you wanted to simply give it away. You all want to be wealthy. It is a universal desire. But what that looks like is going to vary significantly from person to person. Maybe one person, they just want to be able to live in Vegas and live off of room service. Maybe somebody else needs to pay for a medical operation, or someone wants to just retire quietly to a secluded countryside house. It's going to vary depending on what you want. Now, money is essentially a material, but it's also an idea. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. We use it to signify status, but in a nutshell, money or wealth, it allows us to manifest ideas that have no tangibility, and it allows us to make them tangible. So it allows us to actually make things manifest that we would otherwise desire or contemplate. Now, why is this worthwhile studying terrorists? Well, terrorists, because they have political goals, they may have, because of an ideological or religious background, they may have ideas about how the way the world should be that differ drastically from other people. Now, how they use money and interact with their economy is going to tell you a lot about how they are thinking, what they are trying to build, and how they are trying to make their ideas manifest. So the economy or money is socially embedded in our society. What's considered wealthy or would signify status in New York with high-end clothing wouldn't work in Southern California, where we try to put it into our cars, for example. It's going to vary culture to culture. Okay, so I want you to kind of keep this idea in mind of what money is. Now, to move towards terrorism, if you look at different definitions, most agencies, diplomatic corps, intelligence agencies, law enforcement, international organizations, and countries, they all have slightly different definitions of terrorism, but they largely overlap in terms of what terrorism is. And in a nutshell, it's political violence committed by a non-state actor to intimidate a population or government in order to secure some sort of political objective. It could be the creation of a state. It could be enforcing some sort of socio-political norm. It could be joining another state. It could be independence or changing a regime, etc. Now, while there's a lot of overlap in terms of what terrorism is, countries differ significantly on who a terrorist is. And that is much more subjective. So while the definition of terrorism doesn't fluctuate all that much country to country, who is considered a terrorist is going to differ significantly depending on who you ask. Now, terrorists are violent political actors, but they are also economic actors. Okay, they are as economic as anybody else. So we just had, with our wonderful virus, we had toilet paper shortages for a while. Those seem to have dissipated. But to kind of drive this point home, terrorists need toilet paper too. They have bills to pay. They have to pay for gasoline. They have to, pay for soap, etc. They have economic needs, and they interact with the environment economically and their surrounding economy pretty much like anybody else does. in terms of what they need. And once you think about terrorists in that sort of manner, they become a lot more tangible, a little less scary, or significantly less scary, and much easier to try to track or disrupt. Now, most people, they tend to categorize terrorists ideologically or religiously. There is a better way of doing that, especially if you're talking about financing, where you're kind of talking about three sort of models of how strong they are. And this will affect how they raise money, how they move money. You can have virtual networks. Virtual networks, you simply have an ideology out there with maybe a how-to manual on how to be a terrorist. Al-Qaeda a while back had an article on how to cook a bomb or make a bomb in your mother's kitchen, for example. That's sort of an invitation to a virtual network. Basically, you're asking for people to self-radicalize. And then you have classic networks where instead of individuals by themselves, you actually may have a cell that may or may not have interactions with other cells. So, for example, Al-Qaeda back in the 90s and early 2000s, you had cells around the world, and they may be self-funding. We'll talk a little bit about, more about that in a minute. And then you actually have command and control groups where they look more like militaries or governments. They actually control an area. They may wear uniforms, and they have hierarchies and bureaucracies. And then sometimes you have a terrorist group that's simultaneously all of these at the same time. ISIS at its height is an example of that. They had controlled territory, but they also had independent cells, and then they had people who were self-radicalizing, carrying out attacks at the same time. So if you think terrorist financing, maybe something like this comes to mind, kind of the opening scene of Casino Royale, where you have, Jeeps filled with cash going to and from the bank, and then the jungle. That's kind of what pops to mind, but terrorist financing looks more like this. It's not necessarily just cash. It can involve fundraising. Most of the time, it inevitably involves a bank at some point. It can involve antiquities, drugs, anything from stolen technologies or corruption to counterfeit objects. Up there in the upper left-hand corner, those are actually ISIS coins that ISIS minted to launder money. They minted their own gold and silver coins. Now, to kind of talk about terrorist financing, you kind of have to juxtapose it against money laundering. Now, to kind of differentiate a terrorist from a criminal in a couple of ways, most people think terrorists are kind of like organized crime, but in reality, it's much more like voter fraud. Most terrorists, if you look at them economically or their socioeconomic backgrounds, most of them are middle class for whatever background they have or whatever country they're in. Most terrorists are not poor. Some of them are very rich, but most of them are kind of middle of the road. And if you think about terrorism as a political activity, it kind of makes sense, right? You got to have some discretionary time and some discretionary money in order to carry out terrorism, just as if you were knocking door to door for a campaign or volunteering for a charity or something like that. You need some sort of level of discrete resources. So money laundering is essentially designed to separate the illicit origins of wealth from its ultimate end user. Okay, so it's designed to clean the money that is garnered from a predicate crime. So, for example, if you have someone who's a murder for hire, maybe a hitman, they get paid in cash, they're going to have to launder that money in order to buy a car with it or to invest in real estate. Same thing for a drug dealer, anything like that. You have to separate the predicate crime from the money's ultimate end result. Now, terrorism is a little different in that terrorism can often utilize legitimate funds, either that were wages of an individual terrorist themselves, or it could be proceeds from donations or a nonprofit, and it's designed to help facilitate a future crime. So it's, in a way, it's kind of money dirtying. Now, ultimately, on a balance sheet, if it's mixed, the balance sheet and a bank can't necessarily be a good euro. Because once it's in an account, it looks the same. Now, terrorist attacks are fairly cheap to carry out, but a support system can be quite expensive. So to kind of hammer this home. So for example, the Paris attack in 2015, most estimates put the cost of the attack at about $10,000. 9/11 cost about $500,000, but the terrorists were so efficient that they actually returned about $26,000 to Al-Qaeda before carrying out the attack. So it was actually under budget. Suicide vests, most estimates put them at a few $100s to about $1,200. Car bombs can be up to 20,000. And interestingly, thing about car bombs is that the cost of carrying out an attack actually varies depending on the type of car, much more so than the bomb. Now, to kind of give you an example of this, this is a receipt from a wire transfer made to Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh for about $20,000. This was involved in a court case where the plaintiffs who survived and the survivors of a terrorist attack were suing the bank in question. In this case, it was Arab Bank in Jordan. And these are some of the many receipts and documents that accounted for the amounts of money that were flying back and forth between a known terrorist leader and different actors around the world. So about $20,000, you go back to the cost of terrorism, kind of puts it in perspective. Now, money laundering or money dirtying, if you're trying to facilitate some sort of laundering operation or you're trying to facilitate terrorism, it actually has a few distinct phases. So you have the initial proceeds, whether they are gotten illegally or legally, that's the actual placement phase. Then it has to enter the financial system somehow. So if you think about money laundering and crime, for example, it's often depicted in movies. You see criminals with their nightclubs. Well, it's not that they love the nightclub life. It's that it's very easy to have a cash-heavy business that's kind of ephemeral, aka a nightclub. And there's no way that the money that enters a cash register, there's no way of necessarily knowing whether that was achieved by selling drinks legally or illegal drugs. So that is placement phase. And then layering is where the actual laundering occurs. Or the dirtying, or trying to separate its origins from its ultimate destination, whether that be for reintegration into the financial services overall, so you can buy a house if it's criminal proceeds, or to actually use in a crime. So the layering, it may transfer value from one form to another. You're trying to create distance. It could use shell companies. You could be buying an antique and then turning it right around and having that auctioned off. It could be as simple as buying jewelry and then hawking the jewelry, etc. Any of those things could be layering. And then ultimately integration into a bank account so that it can be accessed and used for the above board economy or to facilitate more terrorist attacks if it's terrorist financing. So someone asked me, like, how do terrorists do this? The other day I was helping financial regulators in a course. They were asking about corruption. And they're like, well, can you use this to launder money? Can you use that? And I was like, well, yes, anything with value can actually be used to launder money or finance terrorism. It's not just money or Bitcoin or, informal banking networks, etc. It's anything of value. So it could be illicit sources. It could be drugs, for example. Groups like the Taliban have relied on opium sales from Afghanistan. In South America, the FARC and the AUC have both historically relied heavily on drugs. Many Islamist groups in Europe, at the cellular level, they will actually many of them are street dealers. For example, the attack in Madrid in the early 2000s was actually a street gang that had radicalized. Sometimes you have antiquities. ISIS, many of the antiquities that they ostensibly destroyed actually wound up being sold on the black market. They weren't actually destroyed. State financing, sometimes the government will actually finance a terrorist group. So Hezbollah and Iran is kind of a classic example of this. Some right-wing groups in Europe, more recently, they've started uncovering ties to Russia and some support there. During the Cold War, you had different groups in sub-Saharan Africa, many of whom were financed by Cuba, for example, before the ANC took power. It's an example of that. Sometimes you have support from different elements of society. So, for example, many anarchist groups in Greece historically have some sort of tie to a labor union occasionally. And then you have charities. Many terrorist groups are not just terrorists. People are not just simply evil or good. No one wakes up saying, what evil can I do today? They do a number of things, and in the case of terrorism, they are trying to win hearts and minds to advance an agenda. They have other things that they do other than buying bombs and guns. So, for example, in Lebanon right now with the coronavirus, one of the things that Hezbollah is doing is actually running an ambulance service and medical clinics. Some of them are quite advanced in terms of how they are doing this. It's actually one of the main medical providers. And much of the money for that actually comes from charities. Now, that doesn't mean that the clinics themselves are terrorism, but it's the same organization. So that kind of shows you how dynamic some of these groups can be. Now, virtual networks, the funding will vary by type. Virtual networks can often be self-financed. So, for example, someone who radicalizes themselves could potentially put together an improvised explosive device or buy legal guns to carry out an attack. Classic networks, they may get some support from a central organization, but they can also be self-funding through having a business, for example, or maybe they just take collections, or they have illicit products, maybe drugs that they sell. And then command and control groups can have multiple streams of income. During the Cold War, many of the for example, the Soviets kind of saw drug use as a way to weaken the West. And it was also a way to cut costs, because if you have a group that's relying on you for funding, but they have some of their self-funding from drug sales, they don't need as much state funding. And then some groups actually operate legitimate businesses. So, for example, many unionist groups in Northern Ireland, they actually have their own security companies that are totally above board, and they get some of their money from that. In the case of the IRA and the offshoots from that, many of them survive as basically now being the terrorists. They will actually teach other terrorists how to be better terrorists. Al-Qaeda in the 1990s, they had some legitimate businesses in the Sudan. And what's interesting is that there seems to be a correlation between lack of state funding. The greater the self-funding and the more violent a terrorist group will be. Well, why is that? Well, if the groups are actually trying to support themselves, and some of that support comes from donations, well, they actually are competing for support. So they will actually try to outdo each other in certain cases to try to become a more spectacular terrorist group in order to raise more money. Now, ISIS is kind of an interesting case, or the Islamic State. In 2014, while this was all starting in spring, summer 2014, I was actually living in Turkey on a State Department fellowship, and we were hearing rumors about what was happening in Syria. You had Syrian refugees in the street, and in different parts of Istanbul, you would actually see ISIS graffiti. And when I was calling people back here, no one knew what that was, or had ever heard of ISIS. They thought I was talking about the Egyptian deity. It was totally different. But the Islamic State at its height was actually the most well-funded and richest terrorist group in history. It had revenue from multiple sources, from oil, for example, antiquities trafficking, donations from abroad. They also extorted local businesses, some funding from lone wolves who self-radicalized. They also robbed a number of banks in Iraq early on, and also conducted human trafficking. So from a business standpoint, they were fairly diversified, and this kind of gives you an example of this. We think that at their height, their total net worth was about $2 billion. About 500 million of that we pretty certain came from oil and gas exports, laundered mostly through Turkey. All right, now what about banks? Well, banks inevitably tend to be the resting places for this money once it enters the financial system, because like anybody else, banks are very convenient to use. You can travel around and have access to all of the wealth that you need, that you have. So terrorists are attracted to banks for the exact same reason. They're easy to use, accounts are often insured, and it gives you a lot of liquidity. Now, from a terrorist standpoint, terrorists actually have a trade-off between security and efficiency. The more efficient they are, or the more powerful they get, the less secretive they can be, because the more secretive you are, the harder it is to branch out. So banks, there's an equilibrium that seems to be there, and more work needs to be done on this. But in terms of how terrorist groups actually invest their money, and whether they are cautious investors or more ambitious investors, and I have some theories on that, but that's one project that I'm working on. But banks seem to offer an equilibrium on that. Now, how much terrorist financing or illicit funds there are in the world entirely, most of it is criminal, but terrorist financing is part of that. We don't really know for sure, because we only know about the funds that we catch or we seize. But most models say that if you add it all up, it would be about the size of Spain's economy. And the way that they sort of figured that out was actually by drawing from a model from physics and astronomy and using gravity. It's actually kind of cool how they figured that out algebraically. But we think it's about the size of Spain's economy if you combined all the illicit funds in the world into one economy. So how do you counter terrorist financing? Well, the current sort of way that this is done is through something called Know Your Customer regulations. Basically, you had in the 1970s and 1980s two sort of strands emerging in the regulatory and legal realm. In the US, you had an emerging anti-money laundering regulatory system emerge with the Bank Secrecy Act. So, for example, you had a lot of money laundering taking place from crime in the 1960s in the Caribbean, for example. Believe it or not, Meyer Lansky actually helped some countries in the Caribbean write their bank secrecy laws. While this was occurring, meanwhile, in Europe, you had a number of laws designed to counter terrorist financing. Now, as time went on in the 1980s, 1990s, these legal regimes and regulatory regimes started to meld at the international level. So in 1990, you had the emerging of the Financial Action Task Force, which is basically a best practices committee that was formed by the G7. And most banks around the world now, pretty much without exception, have adopted this same sort of standard. Many countries have adopted the exact same laws as the US in terms of stopping financial financing terrorism or money laundering. And in a nutshell, what it relies on is something called the Financial Intelligence Unit. Now, what that is within every bank, there's a financial intelligence unit. What that is a regulatory office within the bank itself that monitors unusual activities or any activity above a certain legally specified amount. Currently in the US, it's about $10,000. And anytime there's a suspicious activity taking place or there's a transaction over that amount, a report is filed from the bank's financial intelligence unit to the government's financial intelligence unit. In the case of the US, it's based in the Treasury Department. It's called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Now, if a suspicious activity is detected, the bank sends that up to the government FIU, and then the government FIU sifts through it. And then if it looks really suspicious, they will then contact law enforcement at the state and federal level, and then you'll have a real investigation, and eventually the badges and the guns come out of it. So, for example, if you're a teacher in Nebraska, a middle school teacher, and all of a sudden you're spending thousands of dollars at the BMW store in Barcelona, it's going to raise some red flags. You'll probably get a suspicious activity report filed, for example, because that doesn't fit your customer profile. So these laws are around the world now, and pretty much every country after 2001 and 9/11 adopted these exact same laws. With the exception of places like Iran, North Korea, for example. These are pretty much universal now. Now, some drawbacks to the regime. The current system was designed for basically the American system and to a lesser degree, the European banking system. It's not really designed for a lot of economic activity that takes place in a lot of different parts of the world. It also really doesn't do anything to stop lone wolves because we only know about the terrorists that we know about. It doesn't actually do anything to detect radicalization. You also have an enforcement problem where countries may disagree on who is a terrorist and what they consider terrorist financing, even if they have the exact same laws. So, for example, you have banks in the Middle East that have the exact same laws as the US, but they allow certain transactions to occur. And sometimes banks just willingly take the regulatory hit, but they will continue to finance terrorism. So, for example, is either HSBC or Standard Chartered a few years ago. They were laundering a lot of money for Iran. That some of it was terrorist financing. And the British banks basically had an entire division set up to help Iran stay under the radar. So this does happen all over the world. Now, what's interesting is that banks that have some sort of deep structural tie to their home government tend to get away with it, even when it looks like they're financing terrorism. So to kind of clear up some misconceptions, tax havens are actually tend to be better regulated than certain banks elsewhere. So for example, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or Commerce and Credit International, was actually dually based in both Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. And it was eventually shut down and I'll tell you about that in a minute. It's one of the classic cases. And you had Al Barakat Bank, which was actually a bank in Somalia. It was an indigenous bank that was very well regulated. After 2001, it was shut down, even though it was not financing terrorism. It just happened to fit the wrong profile. It relied on informal banking networks, and it was very efficient, and it was actually helping the economy grow, but it was not financing terrorism. In contrast, you have certain banks, like the British banks I mentioned. HSBC has been put under the gun for this, as well as Standard Chartered and a few others. BN Paribas in Paris, for example, is another bank that's been tied to terrorist financing. Al Rajhi Bank has deep ties with the royal family in Saudi Arabia. Bank of China is still government-owned. They helped finance terrorism for Hezbollah. Halkbank in Turkey, it's another fairly large bank in Turkey. They laundered a lot of money for Iran, which I'll tell you about in a second. But the bottom line is, going back to sort of this international relations question, is that even though the laws are universal de jure, they're kind of on the books, that doesn't mean that the laws are actually going to be enforced universally. There's going to be a lot of subjective decisions on, well, is it in the country's best interest to let this slide or not? And that's where it ultimately stops being a legal regulatory issue and becomes a political one. So the Bank of Commerce and Credit and Commerce International was founded in the 70s by Aga Hassan Abadi, and it was basically designed to be a bank for the developing world. And if you read memoirs from people that worked there, it was actually run much more like a cult, but it was actually doubly based in two tax havens, one being the Cayman Islands and the other being Luxembourg. Abadi's first bank had been nationalized by Pakistan. He didn't want that to happen again, so he based it in two tax havens simultaneously, and it is probably the dirtiest bank in world history. It had ties to the Robert Mugabe regime. It helped Iran get nuclear weapons through the AQ Khan network. Believe it or not, Bank of America actually helped it get up and running. It had ties to the Medellin cartel, the Noriega government. It also helped finance the building of Jimmy Carter's presidential library. Multiple intelligence services were using it. It had ties to multiple world leaders. Al-Qaeda relied on it early on and actually modeled some of its own financing structure off of the bank's own structure. It had ties to the Shining Path in Peru, and the list goes on and on. Ultimately, the bank was shut down. In the case of the Caymans, it was not entirely a tax haven. It was still a British protectorate. The Bank of England kind of made it that way and turned a blind eye, but eventually too many things were happening and the bank was shut down in the late 1980s. It's actually depicted in a movie came out a few years ago called The Infiltrator. That was sort of the operation that brought it down. It was a fake wedding. Yeah, truth is stranger than fiction. Then you have Halkbank in Turkey. Halkbank was a government-owned bank that was set up in the 1930s to help modernize the country. It kind of sort of privatized in the 1980s, and inevitably what it ended up doing was helping Iran circumvent sanctions. So there's not really a lot of Turkish oil and gas, but in order to help Iran circumvent currency controls, what it did was it basically exchanged gold for Iranian oil and gas, so that that gold could then be exchanged for hard currency, and some of that would go to Hezbollah. A few years ago, that sort of came apart when a few bribery scandals started to emerge linked to this operation. So that's Reza Zarrab in the far right there. He was the Iranian involved. He kind of masterminded the whole thing as part of an operation of economic jihad, according to him. And he helped organize the entire thing. Eventually, he blew the whistle on it, wound up in U.S. custody. And there was a massive crackdown in Turkey. Many judges were then fired, and many police were retired as a result of that, because ultimately the bank's governing board was controlled by the current president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, or when we were living in Turkey, we affectionately referred to him as Reggie. So he managed to, Halkbank has pretty much gotten away with it. One person was sentenced in the U.S. He came here for a business meeting of some sort and was put in jail for a very brief period of time. And the judge basically said, yeah, it's pretty much symbolic. But it's an interesting case to look at, and kind of shows you how certain banks can get away with it even when there's plenty of documentation that they're guilty of terrorist financing itself. So how do you actually fight this better? Well, traditionally, we kind of rely on sanctions. Sanctions are great. The problem is sanctions only work well with partners that you're doing business with historically very closely. It doesn't help you curtail the activities of entities that do not rely on you for economic activity. So instead of sort of relying on, seize and freeze, it's actually terrorist financing and these regulations, they're much better at tracking and outlying networks as opposed to actually curtailing the practice itself. So actually using banks as an intelligence target, or underwriting banks through certain operations, whether they be legal, law enforcement, or from intelligence services, as a better way of sort of curtailing specific funding of specific groups. You can back clean competitors. You can even run sort of psychological PR operations. Banks care about their reputation too. Lawfare is an example of this. You have the Anti-Terrorism Act of 1990 that allows victims to sue banks that have been involved in the financing of terrorism. And there are other ways of doing that. Now, at the organizational level, when it comes to lone wolves themselves, inevitably you have to kind of get back to this metaphysics of money in terms of trying to track the radicalization through spending behavior. So if how we spend money indicates how we interact with our environment or how we want our environment to be, radicalization, we actually have some pretty good raw data on radicalization and timeframes. One project I'm working on, I can't go too much into it, but relates to this. If you can track the radicalization through spending, that gives you a larger window of time to intervene and potentially thwart an attack. So in other words, you kind of have to detect the evil percolating within to actually stop or intervene and stop the terrorism from occurring. Now, I kind of zoomed through all of that, and with that, I will turn it over to questions.
That was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much, Ian. We do have a couple of questions. I would invite other people to please put your questions into the chat. I want to start out by just asking you to tell a story of like the craziest story that you have heard regarding a terrorist financing gone awry or maybe gone right.
Well, if it went right, we wouldn't have heard about it because they wouldn't have gotten caught. We only hear about the ones that really screw up. I would probably say the wackiest one is definitely the Halkbank case. It involves like Turkish telenovela stars and drugs, and then corrupt officials. And then the guy who happened to come over here for a business meeting and was arrested, even the judge called him a patsy. That's pretty bad. So I would probably say that one, but they're all pretty wild once you dig into them at multiple levels. And everyone keeps asking me, like, how do you study this stuff? I mean, and my advisor during my dissertation was like, you cannot walk into Syria and ask to see their books. And I was like, I'm not going to walk into Syria and ask to see their books. But there's surprisingly a large, if you know where to look, there's actually a lot of good data on this stuff. And we have to build these theories. But in terms of the actual crazy stories, I would say just about any of them. The one with Bank of China, they actually used teddy bears, believe it or not, to finance the terrorism. They went all around the world and they had an auction for teddy bears, and the teddy bears were auctioned off, and then the money from auctioning off the teddy bears inevitably wound up to finance terrorist operations. So anything of value, literally anything of value, could be used to finance terrorism. That's where it gets really crazy.
Michael asked about the capital markets, and I guess more generally, how do terrorists raise funds for their activities?
So that's a good question. Some of that could be criminal, like outright criminal. They could be self-financing through drug operations, maybe rarely, but you can have certain funds that never actually reach the overt financial sector, like the above board banking system, because they just use the cash to then buy illegal whatever. But they can raise it through any number of things. It can be through charities, it could be through drug sales, it could be through intimidation rackets, it could be through legitimate businesses, and just employing, your employees are also the terrorists themselves, terrorist operatives, and you just happen to keep them all together that way. There's any number of ways that they could raise money for that. And in terms of capital markets, some of them invest a lot of money. There's a number of terrorist financiers in Switzerland, for example, that everybody knows who they are, but they haven't been arrested, but they manage mutual funds for groups in the Middle East and others. One of them involved a foundation in Maryland, I believe it was, and then there was a bank in Switzerland, and they actually had a former Nazi running it. It's just wild and crazy once you really start to. You cannot make this up. That's why it's like you really don't need Hollywood when you have the real thing happening, because it's way weirder than anything could be made up.
It sounds like from the questions, Jason might be interested in a career in either the financing or probably the tracking of. I guess what is the career path? What are your sources that you've used, and how do people develop skills and knowledge within this whole terrorist financing world?
So, in terms of a career path, I would say there's different ways of going about it, and it's pretty diverse. Unlike if you're interested in a career in like counterterrorism, where you might have to join the FBI or you join an intelligence service and you just hope to get assigned to terrorism. There are different ways of going about it. Some are lawyers and they just sue on behalf of plaintiffs, and they sue banks. Some are banking regulators themselves, and they are in financial intelligence units within banks. I was at a conference once where I was sitting at this table, and lo and behold, I'm sitting next to, she was the head of their FIU for Bank of America. And I was just like, oh, that's a coincidence. As one of the, my family banks there. It could be totally private sector like that. It could be law enforcement. It could be, you could wind up working for the Treasury Department with FinCEN, or if you're in another country, different countries have their own sort of FIUs in different places. Sometimes central bank, sometimes it's with police, sometimes it's administrative. It really varies from place to place. Or you can kind of do what I did, where, my students are like, oh, you're like Indiana Jones. So I'm like, well, it's not that exciting. But I get calls from time to time, from lawyers or from, different regulators, things like that. The government hasn't knocked on my door yet asking for help. I'm hoping that it does at some point. But yeah, there's different ways of getting into it. It really just sort of depends on what you want to do. Do you want to be a lawyer, a regulator? Do you want to work for the government? Or do you just kind of, want to wing it your own sort of way? There's different ways of getting there.
Robert Meyer asks about the under invoicing or over invoicing in what would be seen as kind of legitimate businesses, international trade or real estate. What is the relative importance of that, and which groups use those invoicing techniques?
So any group could use that. It's not necessarily group specific. it could be anything. One, for example, with the real estate, I know that this is a huge problem in Latin America, where most people simply cannot afford real estate, in part because the prices are drastically inflated, because it's actually where illegal money gets parked. So, for example, you have overbidding for different things, and or they're overspending and over invoicing for the real estate, and you have it's a bubble that never pops because all the money just keeps going into the real estate. This is a big problem in Panama and Colombia, Mexico. I've heard some pretty bad stories about that, because the money ultimately has to get parked, and of course, as it goes up and up and up, it just creates a bubble, and it's an artificial bubble that's not naturally occurring. But under invoicing, over invoicing, it's a way to hide that difference. So you have if I sell you a pencil, right? You give me $10,000 for that pencil. That's on the books. That's your decision. You're getting that pencil, but I guarantee you that I'm not getting the $10,000 for giving you that pencil. You're giving me that $10,000 for something else. It's just on the books. It looks like I'm selling you that pencil.
In the chat, Jack Plax has been putting in a lot of great links. So I hope we can capture those and maybe offer them up to others. But I want to ask Stephanie's question, which is, when we're vetting organizations that work in some of these dicey places, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, whatever, how can we make sure that they are doing legitimate business as opposed to funding, the bad actors in those places?
Well, so that requires a lot of due diligence, to be honest. So if you're talking about doing business with an entity overseas, really you just have to do really good due diligence work. And that's one of the things. Like, I'm starting to do political risk advising for different people with everything that's happening. But it just really comes down to that. You have to know how the economy works. You have to kind of know the place, know what sources who to talk to, and it really comes down to just due diligence. And then ultimately knowing your customer, because even if it's a friendly country, for example. It could be a foundation in San Diego. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not connected. It doesn't have to be in, the Middle East or Afghanistan to be suspect. It could be anywhere. And especially nowadays, the money could be in one part of the world and never actually physically touch or interact with the terrorist who's the ultimate user of that money. So some of that's just really good due diligence. This is where reputation matters. And you can call up different agencies, watchdogs, and actually look to see if it's been suspected in the past. You can look at court records, but it's not easy, but it's doable, and you can kind of assuage your fears with that.
And I'll just give a quick example. I used to work at a foundation, and one of the things that we always looked at was who was giving money where, and anything that was out of whack, we had to report. So that is another added due diligence. Betty Chin from our own Nebraska World Affairs Council asks, do you have any lessons on the current or future dealings with terrorist organizations? What you've done all this research. What can we draw from it, and how can we do better at avoiding some of this terrorist financing?
I think we need to. We kind of have this very sort of sanction-esque way of doing it, where we have a list. And the way it works now is the government puts out a list. The list goes out to the regulators, and then ultimately the banks, and they're like, well, is so-and-so on the list? Well, they're not on the list, but then depending on what group you're talking about, someone could have the same name. And in the case of the Middle East, you have a lot of false positives where, it's, this person can't buy a house because they happen to have the same name as somebody else. And it's very, very inefficient. It doesn't actually tap into what terrorism is, in terms of it's a kinetic way of bringing about a change in ideas and how we interact. That's why the definition of money is actually really important. You have to actually track the radicalization process. someone starts to spend money differently, that will tell you of how they're seeing the world. Now, if you can do that with some nuance, then you can actually start to capture terrorists before they actually commit an attack. That's one way of doing it. The other is just better intel, and instead of freezing everything and forcing the terrorists to switch their tactics, there's a good argument to be made if it's not really distorting the economy, in the case of like drug money with the real estate, for example. It might be better just to let the money move around and follow it and then arrest everybody at the same time. It's more of using it as an informational tool as opposed to, well, we got to, freeze this and then freeze that and, other things like that. I mean, you can, that's one tactic to use, but we kind of have this sort of same reaction over and over and over to it. Instead of thinking about it as a dynamic economic activity, we kind of just see it as a, bad money, freeze it. It takes more nuance than that. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to develop with all the research that I'm doing. We have to think about it differently.
Very interesting. Is there, I understood from one of your slides that a lot depends on the country by country enforcement mechanisms. And some are going to, probably with a wink and a nod, allow more activities, and others might not. Isn't there some international regime, Interpol or something, that has an enforcement mechanism that could put a sledgehammer down on this stuff?
You would think that there is, and some of these groups like the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, would love to say that they're that, but in reality, they're not. All they can do is sort of name and shame and put a country on a warning list. And a lot of people, like Turkey, for example, it's been on the warning list for a while, even though it has all the right laws on the books, etc. But its location and geopolitical importance is going to allow it to do it at once. And with the guy in charge kind of retrofitting the Constitution to suit him, that's where it becomes a political issue. And that's still where you kind of get, and it's going to sound very international relations theory here, but it's still a system of anarchy. There is no hegemon. I mean, the U.S. can do so much because our dollar is very respected and everybody wants the dollar. If we lose that reserve currency status, we won't have that leverage anymore. We'll have other leverages still, but that allows us to sort of create the veneer of having an international regime, but there really isn't one. That's why instead of, treating it like, oh, this country's violating the law, that country's violating the law, that's why the research doesn't add up, because on the books, the laws are all the same. You got the country of Nauru off the coast of Australia has the exact same money laundering laws as the United States. But Nauru has only a couple thousand people, and the closest thing it has to a bank is actually a grocery store. And it actually has cash flown in from Australia on pallets. But it has the exact same money laundering laws because they want it to look good on the books for investors. So they got the U.S. style laws, but there really is no international sort of anything that can do that, and there never will be. So you have to treat it as not something that's international law. You have to treat it as something operationally and geopolitically.
Interesting. There are some other questions. I also want to leave a little time for the wrap up here, but I want to ask if people want to contact you and follow up with any specific questions or conversations, how would they do that, Ian?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I could put my email here, or I guess they could ask you, whichever works, if people can contact you, or I can put it here. It doesn't matter to me.
Sure. If you're willing to put it up there, that's great. Let me ask you, Ian, if you have anything that you'd just like to say to wrap up today before I give it back to Peg and Michael to say something on behalf of the two hosts.
I would say, in terms of like terrorist financing, other than like I'm fascinated that this is actually getting so much attention. It's getting more attention at the popular level than it seems to be at the academic level, which is nice for a change. But I would say that look at your dollars differently. What you do with your dollar is going to say a lot about how you view the world, how you want ideas to manifest or not. Your dollar is a vote. Your dollar is is a unit of utility, but that utility is ultimately up to you and how you spend it. And this is going to sound kind of abstract and, TED Talk-esque, but, how you spend it is going to ultimately define your reality. So who do you do business with? How do you move that money around? And it's not even just money, it's value. So you try to think of it that way. Terrorism is everywhere. It's not a specifically Middle East issue by any stretch. I've been to multiple countries in the Middle East. I've lived in the Middle East, and I can tell you that there's this sort of, and I'm seeing it now, where we're seeing terrorism basically starting to pop up here and there in the U.S., and we're not really using that term, unlike when it's something in the Middle East, like, oh, it's terrorism. No, it's all terrorism, or it's not. It's one or the other, but it's not a specifically Middle East issue. There are groups all over the place. There are more groups all the time. But in terms of the financing, that doesn't change all that much. It's the same sort of game. And that would sort of be my closing thought.
That's great. Thank you. Over to you, Michael, and then to Peg to close us out, please.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Ian. So on behalf of the Nebraska World Affairs Council, I certainly want to thank our speaker, Dr. Ian Oxnevad, for really a fascinating and helpful presentation. If you enjoyed that, stay tuned for Ian's forthcoming book on the same topic. We will post a video of today's event on the Nebraska World Affairs YouTube channel, so you can, I hope to see you all at another one of our upcoming events. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you very much for attending.
I want to voice the same closure that Michael was talking about, with one addition. Michael did such a wonderful job at the beginning of identifying the types of things that World Affairs Council does to bring the awareness of the international, global issues of in the world in which we live. And I thought it was so interesting as Ian was talking. It seemed like he was stressing the points of how what's going on in the world matters absolutely in our own pocketbook, and how the decisions that we make a difference as to the quality of life all across the world. And it was just, I don't know, it was like accidentally coming up with the best example of the description of why learning about global issues is so important. And so we very, very much appreciate it. The title of Ian's book is Making a Killing: States, Banks, and Terrorist Financing. We were hoping that by this time in the year that the book would have been published. And because of the pandemic, we're waiting for it to be there. So what will happen is when it does become available, we'll post it on our site, and I bet you that we can talk Nebraska into doing that as well, because a lot of the detail will be available, and you may not always have your recording of this program with you. I want to thank, of course, all the people that work on the team to put this on. You've been looking at their pictures as we have been sitting here. But it was a big job. I really was impressed with you, Patrick, on the way you managed the questions. That is a very hard job to do without any trip-ups or anything. You do them ahead of time. It was just amazing. I also want to thank our San Diego partners and appreciate the large number of people from Southern California, both the inland area and San Diego, who signed up for the program, and hope you found it as stimulating and interesting as I did. So hope to see you at our upcoming programs. You'll probably be receiving materials from both Nebraska and San Diego and the Inland Council. You may get to the point of not really wanting to know that much about the world, but we look forward to hosting you in any way possible, and stay in touch. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.